Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Victor, for the introduction. It's really my pleasure to be with you today and join the Optical Communications Workshop. There is a lot of energy and excitement in the world of optical comm right now, and we've got that excitement for good reason. Enormous potential to change how we operate and to really make a difference both in how we adapt to space as an increasingly contested domain, but also how we adapt to space as an increasingly crowded domain where we're seeing increasing challenges in managing radio frequency and other scarce commodities in a crowded place. As Victor mentioned, I'm Jamie Morin. I'm with Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. And what I'd really like to focus on in our conversation today is the dynamic moment that we're in. I'll talk a little bit about what awaits us, where we see the path going as well. But if you think back over this last year, it's fair to say it's one of the most transformative years we've experienced in the space enterprise. 2020 has been full, and not just full from a public health and social challenge perspective, but also in terms of real accomplishment, major steps on that road I referred to. Of course, administratively, bureaucratically, we've seen the stand-up of new military service in the United States, the U.S. Space Force. We don't do that very often. It's been 70 years since the last time. And significant step, still early days, but major step in this year. December 20th of last year, technically. My daughter's birthday, actually. We also saw this past May a launch from U.S. soil on a U.S.-built rocket, but a rocket contracted for under a commercial contract. Significant change in how NASA does its business, building on efforts over more than a decade to increase our reliance on the commercial sector. We've seen a phenomenon that's grown up in the commercial sector of reusable launch extend now to the national security sector. We had in June our first national security space launch that used a recovered booster. But not all is lightness, not all is easy or simple out there. We are seeing rising challenges from potential adversaries in space, and it's clear that if there were a future major conflict, that the United States would likely face serious challenges to our space capabilities. And so to deter conflict and to be postured to prevail if there is one, we've got to think carefully and prepare to have the capabilities we would need if space was contested in that way. Major steps this year, all of which I think sets the stage for a coming decade, a decade of the 2020s, which is, I think, really set up to be the most dynamic decade in space history. But if I leave you in this conversation with only one takeaway, let it be this. In the emerging environment, where we're going, the old rules of the road, the old ways of doing business are not going to get us where we need to be. Our concepts of what we know about space, our concepts of how we therefore operate in space, even the kinds of things we seek to do in space need to be reshaped. Central to that reshaping is a much deeper sense of partnership. Partnerships are going to be at the heart of everything we do in space in this exciting decade of the 2020s. We're going to have to forge new partnerships. Some of those partnerships will be within the United States, the government partnering with the commercial sector, partnerships between civil and commercial sector, national security and commercial sector, civil and national security, academia, and others. It's going to be cross-sectoral. It's also going to be international. Probably one of the most substantial advantages in the national security realm that the United States enjoys are alliances and partnerships around the world. Space is an area where we can go further to exploit those in order to truly build the rules of the road that will let us compete and let us succeed in this coming exciting decade of the 2020s. Why do I mention all these points? I mention these points because this kind of conversation that you're having at the Optical Comms Workshop this week are going to help shape and inform discussions about those opportunities and about the challenges we face, but also the strategies we're going to adopt in order to adapt to the changing world. This conference should be a spark for creativity, a spark for partnership, a spark of opportunity that really accelerates progress in optical comm. What I'd like to do is talk about 4 areas where we are seeing the space enterprise evolve. The first one is what I've just mentioned, and it is that partnership piece. There's been a lot of progress, and I want to give you just a few points on that. But I also want to talk about the rise of new space services. That is, we're seeing more areas where the space community is bringing products and services to market that were not conceived of even a few years ago. And that drives a need for new regulatory oversight, new regulatory perspectives in order to balance all of the different considerations that nations have to look at when they license private space activity. I think both the partnerships piece and thinking about new regulatory oversight for new services gets to this fundamental question, which I'd like to address today, which is really how can we support optical communications through both policy and governance steps? You're going to hear me focus today mostly on opportunity and possibility. And that's intentional, but we cannot forget that these opportunities exist in the context of some very real threats. And many of you are exposed to the challenges and threats out there every day. But I wanted to just highlight for those of you who have not been following this closely that these are real and they are salient today. You know, it was just a few months ago that we saw Russia test a space-based anti-satellite weapon. That's the judgment of the United States intelligence community. They've published and laid that out. General Jay Raymond made multiple public statements intended to send a clear message to Russia that the activities they're engaging in are not safe or appropriate. General Raymond said it's further evidence that Russia is pursuing efforts to develop and test space-based weapons, space-based systems that put our assets and those of our allies and partners at risk. I think he called it unusual and disturbing, the way they were maneuvering around a U.S. government satellite. It's not the only time we've seen this kind of action. And the apparent development of these weapons in space is a complement to ample developments demonstrated multiple times over a decade or more of ground-to-space weapons, right? Particularly anti-satellite weapons launched from the ground. This is it's concerning. It is just one symptom of space as a contested domain. Probably even more likely, in the event of a conflict on Earth, is that space is going to be contested in the electromagnetic spectrum with perhaps reversible effects, jamming and the like. And that's one of the areas where this optical communications community, I think, has a lot to offer in terms of providing reliable services in the face of potential adversaries' attempts to disrupt. I think you guys all understand that pretty clearly. So the threats are real. But as I mentioned before, the biggest source of U.S. advantage is our ability to partner. The United States and our close allies represent, if you took a list of the 15 countries with the largest space budgets, we and our allies would make up 11 of those. So that's a pretty good team to have. And those allied partner nations together represent about 2/3 of all the active satellites on orbit. And those numbers are growing as we're getting some of these mega constellations up. So we have a lot of basis for optimism, but we have real work to do to maintain the preeminence of the U.S. space enterprise. Let me talk a little bit about how we do those partnerships. And again, I'm doing this because I think as you are thinking through the challenges and problems in optical comm, if you work through them with a partnerships first ethos, the immediate solutions might be a little harder to come to, but the solutions are going to be more enduring and more readily scaled up. So it may be better to go just a little bit slower or have a little bit harder slog to build a coalition around a solution versus race to market with a single solution, which then may or may not grab the market share and become the standard. Something to be thought through. On the partnership side, the areas where the U.S. government is always most comfortable talking about partnerships are when it comes to space situational awareness, tracking objects, now what we tend to call space domain awareness, and communications. And these are areas where we've got extensive data sharing agreements for the space surveillance, where we've been quite successful in pulling allies and partners into cost sharing agreements and constellation sharing agreements, where we get an allied nation to become a partner in a specific constellation, maybe buy a satellite out of a larger constellation and then share in the access to the whole constellation. Those are all very good and important, and we need to keep pressing in on them. We're taking really deliberate choices, many of which have been set in motion over the last 5 to 10 years, to deepen those partnerships and to find ways where we can be mutually reliant. Notably, we came to an agreement with the government of Norway to launch a U.S. national security payload on their satellite. So a U.S. military payload riding on a foreign nation's satellite as a hosted payload. The estimate is that this approach is going to save the U.S. government, the U.S. taxpayer, almost $1 billion. So, these are the sorts of things we've got to find opportunities to do, because it lets us put our resources to the highest priorities, including things like developing new communications technology that's going to be more resilient. We only get that cooperation when we actually spend time thinking about how we can do it, when we strategically reach out to those partners, and when we're open to the ideas that come to us from others and have a true conversation among equally sovereign nations about how to do it. We've also got to clear away some of the obstacles to sharing. These are classic topics that come up time and time again. Our classification approach with regard to space and our export control approaches. We've got to think through how we manage those, still achieve the core principles for which those systems are set up, right? We don't want to be shipping weapons technology around the world willy-nilly, and we don't want to expose matters, the release of which will damage national security. But it turns out we can achieve those objectives in ways that are less harmful to partnership. We've also got to think through, in that sharing approach, sustainability, right? How do we do these partnerships and this sharing in a way that is not a big headline for one day, but actually a a long-term relationship, one that continues to contribute. So let me pivot to a second topic here, which is oversight of the emerging new services. And this is one where, again, I think the optical communications community's got to look at not just solving internal technical challenges, not just solving the exciting problems in front of you, but rather how does this fit into a broader ecosystem, into an environment where you have multiple commercial and governmental developments happening simultaneously, and a series of interrelated technologies that are making those things happen, changing the game in dramatic ways. I think folks in this audience are probably aware of many of the new services that are being marketed. It's a huge range. I'll just mention a few briefly for time, but we are now seeing companies offering commercial synthetic aperture radar imaging, pretty data intensive stuff, right? We're seeing commercial companies offering high speed, low latency connectivity in low Earth orbit. Might link up nicely with optical crosslinks. Not all of the providers are there quite yet technically, but a big step in optical to the ground could offer another step forward there. More, thinking a little more down the field though, what space services are likely to develop if a constellation like Starlink or one of their many competitors comes to fruition? Let's say they come to fruition primarily focused in the RF to begin with, but then people start building other constellations that take advantage of that communications backbone for commercial purposes, national security purposes, what have you. And then they get hungrier and hungrier for more bandwidth, for lower latency, for more signal reliability, for more resiliency in the face of jamming. It could be a clear evolution here. But many of these new services that are so exciting and have such potential also are operating on uncharted regulatory territory, or only loosely charted regulatory territory. If you think about how the US government regulates commercial satellite activity, we've got communications with the Federal Communications Commission taking a leading role. We have Earth imagery with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at the Department of Commerce taking a leading role. And there's various things associated with flight safety and transit through the airspace where the Federal Aviation Administration plays a key role. Nobody's really laid out in any thoroughly satisfactory way who's going to handle pure space services. The administration proposes putting those in the Department of Commerce. There's other ideas out there. But as we think through that future regulatory environment, say for things like satellite servicing or commercial radio frequency collection, these are both business areas that are not large scale today, but are happening. They are moving forward. We have companies out there, in the case of radio frequency collection on orbit, doing this job at a small scale. In the case of satellite servicing, demonstrating technology and proposing, building client lists. Of course, space tourism activities, and maybe down the road even commercial interplanetary missions of some sort or another. All of these things are going to be operating in a fairly vaguely defined regulatory environment. Many of these things will be interlinked with communications, will require high bandwidth communications, and the optical comms community may find its fate intertwined with them in interesting ways. That leads us to the final topic I wanted to talk about, which is how can we really create the policy and governance structure that will support a robust market for optical comms, or put differently, since the role of policy and governance on this stuff is not really to promote any one specific technology, but rather promote the outcomes that those technologies can deliver. What would the policy and governance framework be that could really help us deliver the promise of optical comms to the many users out there, whether they're national security, commercial, or otherwise? So it is likely to remain the case for the foreseeable future that communications-based services will be the leading component of the space economy. Right? In 2019, more than 40% of the satellites that were deployed on orbit were communication satellites. The numbers are going up dramatically, and the share is still substantial. That was almost 200 satellites that went on orbit in the COM mission in 2019. Obviously, some of them were CubeSat scale, and some of them were, big battleships up in GEO doing very, high throughput mission. Pretty much everybody who's working in the comms market is at least thinking about how optical could change their business. We're looking to this as a potential breakthrough technology. Government has put a lot of money into this market over the years. We've had programs that didn't achieve their promise, but a lot of those challenges have we've seen enormous progress on, and things that might have been high risk or undeliverable, a decade ago, are now within the realm of the achievable. In some cases, even at really small scale. But it's very hard to argue against the promise of optical comm, the very high data rates that we can achieve, the reduced size, weight, and power needs that you get from a tighter beam that's really focusing its energy where it needs to go. The low probability of intercept and detection advantages of those narrow beams, the anti-jam and resiliency performance. Today, there's another attraction to the optical, especially for the commercial users. They don't need a license, right? We've got a robust licensing regime in the radio frequency, but optical is license free. That may not be sustainable in the very long term, but again, some of those attributes of the way we do optical comms make the tipping point where you've got to have serious management of a scarce good like the RF spectrum. That threshold is maybe further off because my use of optical is less likely to interfere with yours. Not zero likelihood, of course, as we all know. So that takes us to what does it take to conduct safe, responsible operations with optical comms, because that's what government licensing and regulation should really focus on, right? Are we able to conduct responsible operations in a safe way that's not going to interfere with others' ability to gain benefit from the domain as well? This is, fundamentally, I think, and I'm talking to an audience that's way more technical than I on this issue, but fundamentally, the challenges are easier in optical than in RF for me not messing with you. We were at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. We were we did some early publication on these issues, and I was joking that our paper should be entitled "Don't Laze Me, Bro," which is a callback to the time when we were looking at the paper, those of you may remember. But the likelihood that I'm lasing you is a lot lower because I've got better control of where my laser's going. I think the bottom line here is that there is room and there is time in the optical communications world because I'm less likely to cause serious interference with you than with RF, to build up a base of norms and best practices so that when it is necessary to do regulation in the sector because of the crowding and level of activity, that we've got a solid foundation of data and analysis and truly understand where we're at and what we need to do. So this is obviously a journey, not a destination. This is a problem and an area that we don't fully understand today, and the scale of which will be defined by the level of success that we enjoy in the technology and the level of adoption that occurs in the commercial and governmental sector. So I think having an early and sustained dialogue between those that are thinking through the policy topics here and those that are solving the hard technical problems is really crucial. And I would look to this conference and to the communities that we're forming in the course of this conference to really give us the basis for that continuing collaboration, for that continuing discussion. So this venue is important for that. It's clear that the decisions we make in this sector are going to be shaping decisions, are going to be decisions that will determine what is possible for future generations. Thankfully, we've built up a pretty good pool of expertise on this, but the experts need to think seriously about the strategic level questions. They need to think about them cooperatively with an eye to that partnerships first approach. And we've got to be willing to always think as to whether the approaches and the modes that got us where we are today will be sufficient to get us where we want to go. And we've got to be willing to change our mode and change our approach in order to get to that vision of a truly exciting decade of the 2020s, which I think is ahead of us. Thanks again to everybody for joining this Aerospace Optical Comms Workshop program. Thanks to the organizers at Aerospace, Victor and the team, for putting it on, even in the face of a global pandemic. I'm really looking forward to hearing the outcomes of the conference and hearing what more folks have to offer. Thank you.